you're mine now." The cold Duke chose her as his maid, but she had already melted his heart. The church bell tolls across a misty morning. Dust swirls as villagers gather, heads bowed low. A cold, untouchable nobleman points into the line of servants. His voice cuts the air like a blade. "You're mine now." But the girl he claims is no ordinary maid. She carries dignity, strength, and a heart that refuses to bow. Each quiet act of kindness unsettles him. Each stolen glance stirs what he swore was buried forever. Yet shadows creep in. Whispers of scandal spread through candlelit halls. A baroness sharpens her tongue, ready to ruin her. And behind closed doors, a secret threatens not only their hearts, but the very name of his house. When the cold Duke finally risks everything to love her, will society destroy them both? Or will love strong enough to melt stone change the fate of an entire estate? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The morning bells of St. Michael's Church rang clear across the village square, their bronze tones cutting through the autumn mist. Eleanor Whitcomb drew her worn shawl tighter. Around her shoulders, her mother's trembling hand clasped in hers as they joined the growing crowd before the Duke of Westhaven's estate. The massive iron gates stood open, a rare sight that drew whispers from the assembled villagers. "He hasn't hired new staff in 3 years," murmured a woman nearby, her voice hushed with gossip. "Not since his wife passed." Eleanor squeezed her mother's hand. "Peace, mother. We need only think of today." At 20 years of age, Eleanor knew their future depended on this morning. Her father's passing had left them with little but her skill. With a needle, and even that barely kept bread on their table. The crowd parted as the estate's steward emerged. His ledger clutched importantly to his chest. "Form a line," he called out, his voice sharp with authority. "His Grace will inspect the candidates himself." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathering. The Duke of Westhaven rarely showed himself for such mundane matters. Eleanor and her mother found themselves in the middle of the queue, surrounded by the whispers and nervous shuffling of their neighbors. The great doors of the manor house opened, and Alexander Greystone, Duke of Westhaven, descended the steps. His tall figure, clothed in black, seemed to draw the very warmth from the misty morning. His face, though handsome, bore the stern lines of one who had forgotten how to smile. Eleanor watched as he moved down the line, his gray eyes cold as he dismissed candidate after candidate with barely a glance. Some he waved away with obvious disgust, others with mere indifference. Each rejection sent another hopeful away with slumped shoulders. When he reached Eleanor, something changed. His steps slowed, and those gray eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her heart stutter. She dropped into a proper curtsy, keeping her gaze lowered as befitted her station. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice low and sharp as a blade. Eleanor raised her eyes, meeting his gaze steadily despite her racing heart. She felt her mother's grip tighten painfully on her arm. The Duke's scrutiny seemed to last an eternity. Then, without warning, his voice cut through the tense silence. "You're mine now." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Eleanor felt her mother sway beside her, and several onlookers crossed themselves. The Duke's words, spoken with such cold possession, sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Dobbs," he called, and a plump woman in a housekeeper's dress appeared at his side. "Show her to the servants' wing. She begins immediately." "But, Your Grace," Eleanor's mother stepped forward, her voice trembling. "My daughter will be well compensated." The Duke cut her off, already turning away. "The steward will see to the arrangements." Before Eleanor could gather her thoughts, Mrs. Dobbs had her arm in a firm but kindly grip. "Come along then, dear," she said, leading Eleanor toward the house. Best not to keep his grace waiting. Eleanor looked back, catching one last glimpse of her mother's pale face through the mist before being ushered through the grand doors. The rest of the day passed in a blur of corridors, instructions, and introductions she could barely remember. That evening, lone in her small room in the servants' wing, Eleanor knelt beside her narrow cot. The room was spare but clean, with a small window that looked out over the shadowy gardens. A single candle flickered on the bedside table, casting dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. "Lord, grant me strength," she whispered, her fingers clasped tightly together. The Duke's words echoed in her mind, making her shiver despite the woolen shawl around her shoulders. "You're mine now," he had said, as if purchasing a piece of furniture rather than employing a person. Eleanor closed her eyes, trying to find courage in the familiar words of her prayers. But the Duke's cold gray eyes and commanding presence seemed burned into her thoughts. "You're mine now," whispered again through her mind. And she hugged herself tightly, wondering what fate awaited her in this grand and forbidding house. The first pale light of dawn crept through the small window of Eleanor's servant quarters, casting long shadows across the narrow bed. She smoothed the rough cotton of her new uniform, plain black with a white apron, marking her as one of the Duke's household staff. The fabric was sturdy but scratched against her skin, so different from the fine materials she once worked with. In her father's shop, down in the bustling kitchen, the clatter of pots and pans mixed with hushed whispers that fell silent as Eleanor entered. Mrs. Dobbs, the cook, stood at the great hearth, stirring a pot of porridge with determined strokes. "Well, if it isn't her Grace's chosen one," sneered Mary, one of the senior maids, her voice carrying across the kitchen. "Did you bewitch him, then, to pick you out special-like?" "Now, Mary," Mrs. Dobbs interrupted, brandishing her wooden spoon. "That's enough of that. The girl's here to work, same as the rest of us." She turned to Eleanor with kind eyes. "You're to report to the linen room, dear. 3rd floor, east wing." Eleanor nodded gratefully and hurried away, the whispers following her up the servants' stairs. The linen room was a large, well-lit chamber filled with shelves of neatly folded sheets and tablecloths. A basket of torn items sat waiting for attention as she sorted through the linens requiring mending. Something caught her eye, a flash of deep blue silk beneath the plain white sheets. Eleanor's breath caught as she carefully lifted out a lady's gown of the finest French silk. Even creased and damaged, its beauty was unmistakable. A jagged tear ran down one side as though someone had grabbed and ripped it in anger. The Duchess's favorite, came a quiet voice. Eleanor turned to find Mrs. Dobbs in the doorway. It happened the night before she died. His Grace, well, he'd been drinking heavily in those days. The gown was to be burned, but somehow it ended up here instead. Eleanor ran her fingers over the tier. Such lovely fabric, and the embroidery is exquisite. Making her decision, she reached for her sewing basket. It deserves to be whole again. "Mind you, don't let anyone catch you at it," Mrs. Dobbs warned, but her eyes were approving as she left. For hours, Eleanor worked with painstaking care, her needle weaving invisible stitches through the delicate silk. She matched every thread, perfectly restored each tiny pearl that had come loose. The work absorbed her so completely that she didn't hear the approaching footsteps. "What are you doing?" The Duke's cold voice made her jump. He stood in the doorway, tall and forbidding in his black coat, his face a mask of controlled anger. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she refused to cower. "My lord, I found it among the linens." I thought perhaps she held up the gown, now restored, to its former glory. "I couldn't bear to see such beauty destroyed." The Duke strode forward, snatching the gown from her hands. His fingers traced the place where the tear had been, now seamlessly mended. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, pain, memory, wonder, before his expression hardened again. "You presume too much," he snapped, but his voice lacked its usual bite. "Return to your proper duties. This is not your concern." He turned on his heel and stalked away, taking the gown with him. As evening fell, Eleanor returned to the linen room to tidy away her things. She carefully placed the dress form back in its corner, remembering how the blue silk had shimmered in the afternoon light. "I pray this small work eases his grief," she whispered to the empty room, heart aching for the man whose pain ran so deep he could only express it through anger. Unknown to her, the Duke stood in the shadows of the doorway, his jaw clenched tight as he watched her. Her quiet dignity, her gentle handling of his late wife's gown, stirred something in him he'd thought long dead. He turned away abruptly, unsettled by the warmth trying to thaw his frozen heart. Eleanor's arms ached from the weight of fresh linens as she made her way through the dim corridor of Westhaven Manor. The flickering light of wall sconces cast dancing shadows on the oak-paneled walls. As she approached the library, raised voices made her pause mid-step. "The Duke must see reason," came the urgent whisper of Mr. Graves, the steward. "The estate's debts grow more pressing by the day." "Then my proposal comes at an advantageous time, does it not?" The silky voice belonged to Lady Margaret Fairfax. Eleanor recognized its carefully cultured tones from the Baroness's previous visits. Eleanor knew she shouldn't listen, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The heavy linens pressed against her chest as she held her breath. "Lady Fairfax, your offer of marriage would indeed solve many difficulties," Mr. Graves continued. "Your fortune combined with the Duke's title, and yet he resists." Lady Fairfax's voice turned sharp. "One would think he preferred the company of servants to proper society. That little seamstress, for instance, I've noticed how he watches her." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "A passing fancy, my lady," the steward assured her. "Nothing more. A peasant girl too near the Duke's notice." Lady Fairfax spat the words. "It's unseemly. The Duke needs a woman of breeding to restore this house to its former glory, not some thread-pulling nobody." Lena's cheeks burned. She forced her trembling legs to move, hurrying past the library door as quietly as possible. The voices faded behind her, but their words echoed in her mind. That evening, as Eleanor folded sheets in the laundry room, a footman appeared with a message. The Duke demanded her presence in his study immediately. The Duke stood at the window. When she entered, his tall figure outlined against the gathering dusk. Without turning, he spoke. "There will be a dinner party here in 3 days' time. You will attend me personally." Eleanor's stomach clenched. "Your Grace, you'll serve at my right hand throughout the evening." Now he faced her, his expression unreadable. "I trust you can manage that without embarrassing yourself." "Yes, Your Grace." Eleanor dropped into a curtsy, though inside she quivered. To serve at the Duke's table meant facing Lady Fairfax and other nobles who would surely look down their noses at her. "Good. Mrs. Dobbs will instruct you in the proper serving etiquette." He waved his hand in dismissal. "That will be all." Later. That night, Eleanor lay in her narrow bed, unable to sleep. The thought of the upcoming dinner filled her with dread. She would be on display before all those critical eyes, especially Lady Fairfax's. Why had the Duke chosen her for this task? Was it, as the Baroness suggested, some sort of unseemly attention? Or was it a test of some kind? Through her small window, she could see the first frost of the season settling like diamond dust over the estate's gardens. The roses her father had once tended, before debt had stolen their home, would be wilting now. Everything beautiful seemed to fade in time, she thought, just as her own dreams of a respectable future might be fading. The night air grew colder, seeping through the thin walls of her servant's chamber. Eleanor pulled her blanket tighter, but still sleep eluded her. In 3 days she would face the assembled nobility, their judgment, their whispers, and Lady Fairfax would be watching her every move, waiting for her to make a mistake. Outside, the frost continued its silent work, painting the gardens white, while inside, Eleanor's mind whirled with worries about the dinner to come. Each chime of the distant church bell marked another hour of sleepless anxiety. As the first bitter cold of autumn claimed the estate grounds, candlelight blazed from 100 beeswax tapers in the great hall of Westhaven Manor. Their golden glow caught the polished marble floors and crystal goblets, making everything shimmer like starlight. Eleanor stood quietly near a corner. Her plain brown servants dressed a stark contrast to the silks and jewels that swirled around her. Her hands gripped a silver tray of wine glasses, steady despite her racing heart. Outside, the crunch of gravel announced each new arrival. Liveried footmen opened carriage doors, helping ladies in elaborate gowns descend the steps. Their jewels sparkled in the light spilling from the manor's windows. "Your Grace," Eleanor murmured as the Duke passed near her station. He gave a slight nod, his dark eyes meeting hers for just a moment. She noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his shoulders stiffened as each new guest arrived. "My dear Duke." Lady Fairfax's voice rang out above the general murmur. "How charitable of you to have your servants so visible this evening." Her painted lips curved in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Eleanor felt rather than saw the Duke's irritation. His back straightened further, if that was possible. "I believe in acknowledging good service, Lady Fairfax," he said coolly. The evening progressed in a swirl of courses and conversation. Eleanor moved silently through the crowd, replacing empty glasses with full ones. She kept her eyes lowered, but her ears caught the whispers. "Did you see how he watches that serving girl? Most irregular. Something must be done." A crash from the dining room made everyone turn. Young Tommy, one of the newer footmen, had stumbled, sending a tureen of soup splashing across the floor. His face went white as Lord Pembroke rose from his chair with an oath. "Clumsy oaf," the nobleman thundered. "This coat is worth more than your yearly wages." Before anyone could move, Eleanor set down her tray and stepped forward. "My lord," she said clearly, dropping a curtsy, "please allow me to assist. We have an excellent solution for soup stains that will preserve your coat perfectly." She turned to Tommy, who was trembling. "Fetch me the lavender water and some clean cloths from Mrs. Dobbs, if you please." The room had gone silent. Lord Pembroke's face darkened. How dare a mere servant address? "The girl speaks sense, Pembroke." The Duke's voice cut through the tension like a knife. All heads turned to him in surprise. "Eleanor has shown remarkable skill in preserving fine fabrics. I suggest you accept her assistance." Eleanor's hands barely shook as she cleaned Lord Pembroke's coat, while other servants quickly cleared away the spilled soup. She felt the Duke's eyes on her, but didn't dare look up. "There, my lord," she said softly when she had finished. "The stain will lift completely once it dries." The Duke cleared his throat. "Thank you, Eleanor," he said, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Your thoughtfulness does you credit." Gasps rippled through the assembly. A Duke thanking a servant by name. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she kept her composure, curtsying deeply before returning to her station. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of voices and movement. Finally, the last carriage rolled away, leaving only the sound of crickets and the soft padding of servants clearing tables. Eleanor found herself in the kitchen, standing before the great hearth where flames still danced. The warmth helped steady her trembling limbs. She could still see the Duke's face when he had defended her, the way his stern features had softened just slightly, the unexpected kindness in his eyes. Mrs. Dobbs appeared at her elbow with a cup of tea. "Well now," the cook said with a knowing smile, "that was quite an evening, wasn't it?" Eleanor wrapped her fingers around the warm cup, remembering how the Duke had looked at her. For just a moment, It had felt as though the great gap between their stations had narrowed, like a bridge appearing over what had seemed an impossible chasm. The fire crackled softly, and her heart continued its wild dance in her chest. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, she allowed herself to savor the memory of those gentle words that softened gaze. Meant for her alone, Chapter 5, The Healing Heart, Scene 1. The morning after the noble dinner dawned cold and gray. Eleanor hurried across the frost-covered courtyard, her breath forming little clouds in the chilly air. The sound of distressed voices near the kennels made her pause mid-step. Through the morning mist, she saw the kennel master wringing his hands, his weathered face etched with worry. "He won't eat, hasn't touched water since yesterday," the old man muttered to himself. "His Grace will be heartbroken if anything happens to this one." Eleanor approached cautiously. "What troubles you, Master Thompson?" The kennel master startled, then gestured toward one of the larger enclosures. "The Duke's favorite hunting hound. Miss? Taken ill, something fierce. Won't respond to any of my usual remedies." Inside the kennel, a magnificent brown and white hound lay motionless on its side, its breathing labored. Eleanor's heart clenched at the sight. The dog's nose was hot and dry when she knelt beside it, gently touching its muzzle. "These symptoms," she murmured, memories of her mother's teachings flooding back. "Master Thompson, might I try something? My mother knows much about healing herbs and taught me well." The kennel master hesitated, then nodded desperately. "Can't make him any worse? Mrs. Grace will have my position if this dog dies." Eleanor rushed to gather what she needed: fresh water, clean cloths, and herbs from the kitchen garden. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind as she carefully crushed mint leaves and yarrow flowers, mixing them with honey from the kitchen stores. The morning hours slipped away as she tended to the sick animal, speaking softly and stroking its fur between treatments. "There now, brave fellow," she whispered, coaxing tiny amounts of the herbal mixture past the hound's teeth. "Your master needs you well again." As afternoon faded into evening, Eleanor refused to leave the dog's side, even when other servants called her to her regular duties. She sat in the straw, keeping watch as candles were lit across the estate and stars began to peek through the gathering clouds. The hound's head rested heavily in her lap, its breathing still shallow but steadier than before. The gentle rhythm of the dog's breath and the warmth of its ear body against her skirts slowly lulled Eleanor into an exhausted sleep she didn't hear. The approaching footsteps in the pre-dawn hours didn't notice the tall figure that stopped short in the kennel doorway. The Duke of Westhaven stood silent, watching his most beloved hound sleeping peacefully in the lap of a servant girl. Eleanor's face, even in sleep, showed signs of concern, one hand resting protectively on the dog's neck. Without a word, the Duke removed his heavy cloak and, with unexpected tenderness, draped it over Eleanor's shoulders. The movement caused Eleanor to stir. Her eyes fluttered open to find the Duke kneeling beside her in the straw, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. "Your Grace," she gasped, trying to rise, but the dog's weight kept her in place. "Be still," he commanded, though his voice held none of its usual sharpness. "The kennel master told me what you've done." As if sensing its master's presence, the hound lifted its head weakly, its tail thumping against the straw in a gentle wag. The Duke's breath caught, and he reached out to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I feared I would lose him too," the Duke said quietly, more to himself than to Eleanor. Then, meeting her eyes directly, he added, "You have my sincere gratitude, Miss Whitcomb." Eleanor felt warmth spread through her chest at his words, at the way he spoke her name with such genuine appreciation. "It was no trouble, Your Grace. My mother taught me well about healing herbs." The hound struggled to its feet, wobbling slightly but standing nonetheless. Its tail continued to wag as it looked between its master and its nurse. The Duke's face broke into a rare smile at the sight, and Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. Later that evening, safely back in her small chamber, Eleanor held the Duke's cloak in her hands. The heavy fabric still carried his scent, a mixture of leather and pine and something distinctly noble. Her fingers traced the fine embroidery at the edges as she recalled the warmth in his eyes, the gentleness in his voice when he thanked her. She pressed the cloak to her chest, knowing she should return it immediately, but allowing herself just one moment to hold it close. To remember the way he had looked at her, not as a servant, but as someone worthy of his gratitude and respect. Her heart fluttered traitorously in her chest, and Eleanor knew she was in danger of feeling something she had no right to feel for a duke. Heavy snow drifted down from leaden skies, coating West Haven Estate in pristine white. Inside the grand ballroom, servants scurried about, hanging crystal-draped garlands and positioning dozens of beeswax candles for the evening's masquerade. Eleanor's fingers trembled as she smoothed her plain serving gown, her heart fluttering at the enormity of the night ahead. "Remember," Mrs. Peters, the housekeeper, instructed sharply, "you are to remain invisible while serving the wine. The nobles do not wish to acknowledge the help, especially at a masquerade." Eleanor nodded, though her mind wandered to the Duke. Since that morning in the kennels 2 weeks ago, something had shifted between them. His eyes would linger on her when they passed in corridors, and sometimes she caught the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. As evening fell, the ballroom transformed into a glittering wonderland. Hundreds of candles cast dancing light across gilt-edged mirrors while masked figures in silken velvet swept through the doors. Eleanor moved carefully through the crowd. Her silver wine tray balanced perfectly as she had been taught. Behind their elaborate masks, the nobles spoke more freely than usual. Eleanor kept her eyes downcast, but her ears caught fragments of conversation, trade agreements, marriage proposals, and whispered scandals. Then, near a shadowed alcove, she heard something that made her blood run cold. "The deed is perfect," Lord Ashcombe's voice carried, thick with wine and triumph. "His Grace will never know it's forged. Once he signs it over, thinking it's his grandfather's original agreement, that choice piece of timberland will be mine." Eleanor's hands tightened on her tray. Lord Ashcombe continued speaking to his conspirator, detailing how he had copied the Duke's grandfather's signature. The timberland in question, Eleanor knew, supported 3 village families who would be ruined if it changed hands. She stood frozen, torn between her station and her conscience. The Duke had shown her kindness, particularly since she had nursed his hound back to health. Could she dare speak up? The consequences for being wrong would be severe. Drawing a deep breath, Eleanor set down her tray and made her way to where the Duke stood. His tall figure, unmistakable, even behind a black velvet mask. She curtsied deeply. "Your Grace," she whispered, "forgive my boldness, but I must speak with you on an urgent matter." The Duke's eyes narrowed behind his mask, but he gestured for her to continue. In hushed tones, Eleanor related what she had overheard. His posture stiffened as she spoke, his jaw tightening visibly beneath the mask. Without a word, he strode toward the alcove where Lord Ashcombe still plotted. Eleanor watched, heart pounding, as the Duke confronted him. Lord Ashcombe's face turned, pale as parchment, when the Duke demanded to see the document in question. This signature, the Duke's voice carried across the suddenly silent ballroom as he examined the paper, is indeed forged. Did you think I would not recognize my own grandfather's hand? Guards, as Lord Ashcombe was led away, protesting weakly. The Duke turned back to Eleanor. The entire assembly watched, breathless, as he approached her. Eleanor felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, some scornful, others curious. "You have done me a great service this night," the Duke announced clearly. Then, to the astonishment of all, he extended his hand. "Would you honor me with this dance?" Eleanor's heart nearly stopped. "Your Grace, I am but a servant." "Tonight," he said softly, "for her ears alone, you are my savior." The orchestra struck up a gentle minuet. Eleanor placed her trembling hand in his, and he led her to the center of the ballroom. She thanked heaven for all the time she had practiced the steps alone in her chamber. Dreaming of such an impossible moment, they moved together as if in a dream, the Duke guiding her surely through the figures of the dance. His hand was warm against hers, his eyes never leaving her face. For those precious minutes, the sneers and whispers of the nobles faded away, and Eleanor felt like a character from a fairy tale. As the final notes faded, the Duke bowed over her hand, and reality crashed back. Eleanor curtsied deeply and fled the ballroom, her cheeks burning. She didn't stop running until she reached her tiny chamber in the servants' wing. There, she leaned against her door, her whole body trembling. The Duke had chosen to dance with her, a common seamstress, in front of the entire assembly. Her heart soared even as fear gripped her. What would tomorrow bring? But for now, in the privacy of her room, she pressed her hands to her flushed cheeks and allowed herself to remember the warmth of his touch, the strength of his hand holding hers, and the way he had looked at her as if she were the only person in the room. 2 mornings after the masquerade, the laundry room hummed with unusual tension. Steam rose from the washing tubs as Eleanor made her way between the drying linens, the familiar scent of soap and dampness filling the air. She noticed immediately how the other maids fell silent at her approach, their eyes darting away as they bent over their work. Sarah, a kitchen maid Eleanor had always considered friendly, whispered something behind her hand to Betty, who gasped and shot Eleanor a scandalized look. The whispers followed Eleanor like autumn leaves skittering across cobblestones. "Did you hear?" One voice murmured. "Lady Fairfax says, the Duke's mistress." "They're saying," another voice added. Barely audible over the splash of water, Eleanor's hands trembled as she folded sheets, her chest tight with distress. The words seemed to echo off the stone walls, multiplying until they filled the entire room. She kept her head down, trying to focus on her work, but each sideways glance and hushed conversation pierced her heart like tiny needles. By midday, the rumors had spread through the entire household like wildfire. Servants who once smiled at Eleanor now turned away when she passed. The housekeeper's stern gaze followed her everywhere, heavy with disapproval. The worst came that afternoon. Martha, a village woman Eleanor had known since childhood, arrived at the servants' entrance with tears in her eyes. "Oh, Eleanor," she said, wringing her hands. "Your poor mother, Lady Fairfax's carriage, stopped in the village square. She told everyone within hearing that you, Martha, couldn't finish the sentence." Eleanor's knees weakened. "My mother. How is she?" "She's taken to her bed with shame, child. The neighbors, they're all talking. Some won't even look at her now." The weight of it all crashed down on Eleanor's shoulders. Her mother, who had sacrificed everything to raise her with dignity after father's death, now suffered because of these vicious lies. She had to do something, had to make this right. With trembling resolve, Eleanor made her way to the Duke's study. She knocked softly, then entered when bid. The Duke stood by the window, his broad shoulders tense, one hand resting on the mantel. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I must speak with you about the rumors." The Duke didn't turn. "I am aware of them." His voice was cold, distant, so different from the warmth she'd glimpsed at the masquerade. "My mother's reputation is being destroyed. Please, if you would just tell them what, exactly." Now he did turn, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. Instead, they fixed on some point over her shoulder. "That I danced with a servant. That I've shown you consideration. I have responsibilities, obligations." My position, Eleanor's heart cracked. At his words, she understood then he would not defend her. Could not, perhaps, without risking his own standing among the nobility. The same social barriers that had always existed between them now rose up like iron gates, trapping them both. "Understand, Your Grace," she said softly, dropping into a deep curtsy. "I shall remove myself from your household. It's the only way to protect your honor and my mother's." Still, he wouldn't look at her. His jaw clenched, his hands fisted at his sides, but he said nothing. The silence stretched between them like an endless winter night. Eleanor backed out of the study, closing the door quietly behind her. Each step back to her little chamber felt heavier than the last. That night, she sat on her narrow bed, a single candle casting wavering shadows on the wall. Her few belongings lay spread before her, 3 simple dresses, her mother's worn prayer book, the sewing kit she'd had since childhood. Tears fell steadily as she folded each item carefully into her small bundle. The flame flickered, making the tears on her cheeks glisten. She touched the rough wool of her traveling cloak, the one she'd worn on that first morning of the hiring fair, when the Duke had pointed to her and changed her life forever. Now she would wear it again, walking away from all that might have been. Eleanor wiped her eyes with trembling fingers and continued packing. Come dawn, she would slip away quietly, taking the scandal with her. It was the only gift she could give him now, freedom from the whispers, from the stain on his reputation that her presence had caused. The candle burned lower as she worked, its light catching on the silver needle in her sewing kit, the one she'd used to mend his late wife's gown. The first time she'd seen something other than coldness in his eyes. She wrapped it carefully in a scrap of cloth and tucked it away, one last precious memory to carry with her. Dawn painted the sky in shades of pewter, its cold light seeping through the morning mist. Frost had transformed the estate's grounds into a crystalline wonderland, each blade of grass glittering like tiny diamonds. Eleanor stood at the servants' entrance, her worn carpet bag clutched in mittened hands, her heart as heavy as the winter clouds above. Mrs. Dobbs emerged from her warm kitchen, her usually cheerful face drawn with concern. The smell of fresh-baked bread followed her into the bitter morning air. "You need not go, child," she said, pressing a small wrapped bundle of food into Eleanor's hands. "The gossip will pass, as all things do." Eleanor managed a weak smile, touching the cook's flour-dusted cheek. "Your kindness has meant the world to me, Mrs. Dobbs, but I must protect his reputation, even if it breaks my heart to leave." Young Tom, the stable boy, shuffled his feet in the frost-covered gravel. His eyes were red-dreamed as he held out Eleanor's mother's shawl, which she had nearly forgotten in her haste. "We'll miss you something terrible, Miss Eleanor," he mumbled, with a final embrace from Mrs. Dobbs and a gentle pat on Tom's shoulder. Eleanor turned toward the long road leading to the village. Her footsteps crunched on the frozen ground, each step carrying her further from everything her heart held dear. The weight of her carpet bag seemed nothing compared to the burden of leaving. Meanwhile, within the great house, the Duke's mourning routine was disrupted by an unusual commotion. His valet entered without ceremony, face pale. "Your Grace, the seamstress, Miss Wickham, she's gone." The Duke's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Gone? What nonsense is this?" "She left at first light, Your Grace. Mrs. Dobbs says she meant to protect your reputation from the rumors." The Duke surged to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. He stormed through the corridors, his boots echoing on the marble floors, until he reached the servants' wing. Eleanor's small chamber stood empty, the narrow bed stripped bare. On the dresser lay her neatly folded uniform, topped with a simple note, "With gratitude for your kindness. E.W." Something broke inside the Duke's carefully maintained facade. The sight of that modest room, stripped of her presence, made him realize what a fool he'd been. The memory of her gentle smile, her quiet dignity, the way she'd cared for his beloved hound. All the moments he'd tried to deny meant anything rushed over him like a flood. "Ready my carriage," he bellowed, his voice carrying through the corridors. Immediately, servants scattered to obey as the Duke paced the entrance hall, his cloak hastily thrown over his shoulders. The minutes it took to prepare the carriage felt like hours. All his carefully constructed reasons for keeping his distance, propriety, social standing, fear of gossip, seemed hollow now against the prospect of losing her forever. On the frost-hardened road, Eleanor walked steadily, though each step felt heavier than the last. The morning mist had begun to lift, revealing the estate's turrets in the distance. She paused, turning to look one final time at the place that had become home, at the walls that held so many memories of him. "Farewell, my heart," she whispered, her words forming small clouds in the cold air. Tears threatened to freeze on her cheeks as she gazed at the great house where she'd found and lost everything that mattered. The sound came slowly at first, just a faint rumble on the frozen road. Then it grew louder, the distinctive sound of carriage wheels and hoofbeats approaching rapidly from behind. Eleanor stepped to the side of the road, pressing her handkerchief to her eyes. She would not let whoever it was see her tears. The carriage thundered to a halt beside Eleanor, sending sprays of frost from its wheels. Her heart leaped into her throat as she recognized the Duke's personal crest on the door. Before she could gather her wits, the door flew open. And there he stood, the Duke of Westhaven himself, his cloak billowing in the winter wind, his eyes aflame with an intensity she had never seen before. "Eleanor," his voice carried across the frozen morning air, drawing the attention of villagers heading to market and servants on their morning errands. They gathered at a respectful distance, watching with wide eyes as their usually composed Duke strode through the snow toward the trembling seamstress. "Your Grace," Eleanor whispered, dropping into a curtsy, her carpet-bag falling forgotten into the snow. "I must go. The rumors, damn the rumors," he declared, loud enough for all to hear. His words shocked gasps from the growing crowd. "Been a fool, Eleanor Whitcomb, letting fear of scandal and pride rule my heart." Two passing farmers removed their caps, and a group of maids hurrying to work stopped dead in their tracks. More villagers emerged from the morning mist, drawn by the unprecedented sight of their Duke standing in the snow-covered road. "My Lord," Eleanor began, but he raised his hand, silencing her protest. "No, you must hear me. I wanted to believe. I kept you close because you were merely a capable servant. I told myself your presence in my house meant nothing more than your skill with needle and thread." His voice softened. "But when I found your chamber empty this morning, I realized the truth I've been denying." The Baroness's carriage appeared on the road, its driver pulling the horses to an abrupt stop at the sight before them. Lady Fairfax's outraged face appeared at the window, but the Duke paid her no mind. "You are neither servant nor mistress to me, Eleanor," he proclaimed, taking her cold hands in his warm ones. "You are the woman who brought light back into my darkened halls. The woman who healed not just my hound, but my heart." He turned to address the gathered crowd. "I reject any scheme to marry for mere advantage or wealth. True nobility lives in the heart, in actions of kindness and courage, qualities I have witnessed daily in this remarkable woman." Murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Dobbs, who had followed in the Duke's wake, dabbed at her eyes with her apron. Even Lady Fairfax's coachman nodded in appreciation of the Duke's words. Eleanor's hands trembled in his grasp as hope, terrifying and wonderful, began to bloom in her chest. "But the difference in our stations," she whispered, "means nothing," he finished firmly. "If you'll have me, Eleanor Whitcomb, I offer not a position in my household, but a place at my side as my wife, for the first time since he had proclaimed your mine on that autumn hiring day." Eleanor allowed herself to believe in the impossible. Tears froze on her cheeks as she gazed up at him, seeing not the fearsome Duke of Westhaven, but simply the man she had grown to love. His grip on her hands tightened as he waited for her answer, his breath forming clouds in the winter air between them. Spring sunshine streamed through the parish. Churches stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns across the worn stone floor. The pews were filled to bursting with villagers and nobles, alike gathered for the most talked-about wedding in living memory. Though tradition dictated their seating, nobles in the front, merchants in the middle, and common folk at the back, all faces shared the same eager anticipation. The restored gown of the late Duchess gleamed softly as Eleanor stood at the church door, her heart fluttering like the newly returned sparrows in the eaves above. The Duke had presented it to her 3 days prior, his eyes glistening as he told her how she had mended not just the gown, but his faith in love itself. As the organ began to play, Eleanor took her first step down the aisle. Sunbeams caught the delicate embroidery she had so carefully restored, making the silk shimmer like morning dew. The Duke, standing tall and proud at the altar, drew in a sharp breath at the sight of her. Gone was his icy mask of indifference. In its place shone pure adoration. Mrs. Dobbs, the cook, dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief. The stable boy who had bid Eleanor farewell that snowy morning grinned broadly from his place near the back. Even Lady Fairfax, who had eventually withdrawn her opposition with surprising grace, nodded approvingly from her front row seat. Before the altar, Eleanor and the Duke joined hands. His fingers trembled slightly against hers of vulnerability. He now allowed her alone to witness. The priest opened his book, and a holy hush fell over the congregation. "I, Charles, Duke of Westhaven," he spoke clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the church, "take thee, Eleanor Whitcomb, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward." His eyes never left hers as he continued, "Before God and these witnesses, I vow to cherish you above all others, to honor your gentle heart, and to love you until my dying day." When Eleanor spoke her vows in return, her voice was steady and sure. The congregation, once scandalized by their attachment, now sat transfixed by the obvious devotion between them. As the priest pronounced them man and wife, spontaneous applause erupted throughout the church, breaking centuries of formal tradition. That evening, as twilight painted the sky in soft purples and pinks, the Duke led Eleanor through the estates, gardens. Spring flowers nodded their heads in the gentle breeze, their sweet perfume filling the air. The same path where she had once hurried as a servant now felt different beneath her feet. It was the path of home. They paused beside a blooming rose arbor, where the Duke turned to face her. His fingers gently traced her cheek as he whispered, "You are mine, Eleanor, not by command, but by choice." Eleanor's heart swelled with joy as she replied, "And I am yours, forever." In the gathering dusk, the once cold Duke's heart had found its eternal spring, warmed forever by the love of his seamstress bride. Thank you for watching. If this one reached you, consider subscribing. I'll be back tomorrow with more meaning, more humanity.